Well, again, we'd like to welcome you all to this wonderful panel. And per the schedule, Jeff Gardner could not join us due to a family emergency or commitment. But we have wonderful panelists, and since they've already been introduced, really when we were talking about the topic, managing the enormous in and of itself is, people say, what does that mean? And in many ways, as we were trying to define it, that was the question. Because in today's day and age, what we find is there are a lot of major tasks that organizations have to deal with. And to each organization, it really is that what managing the enormous could be very, very different. I mean, you look at Apple, and for Apple, it could be, what do we do with $250 billion in cash, most of which is stuck overseas? Or how do you manage the expectations of the 10th anniversary iPhone that's set to come out this fall? If you're Netflix, they just crossed 100 million users in 190 countries. How do you continue to delight these customers with all the other competition and other types of issues? So managing the enormous could be very much a product issue, could be an employee issue, it could be an growth issue. And so we're really very fortunate because of the diversity of our panelists with their own experience and the companies they work with. As was mentioned, we have Frank Roach from a 76 grad, CEO of Ferguson. We have Mike Matakunas, which I won't, I'll put, not with Walmart. No, I know Dollar Tree. And with Dollar Tree as well, 93 grad, and Nathan Tykach, a 91 MBA grad. And what I thought is that I would start off just with a simple question. Well, actually, it's not a simple question, but really to each of you in your personal or your professional position or to your organization, what does managing the enormous mean to you? So, Frank, we can go ahead.
I'll start. Well, for us, and actually, Brent, it was a very timely question with some of the things we have going on today. But when I looked at the question, for me and for Ferguson, managing the enormous is all the change that's going on in the world today. And the enormity of the change and the pace or cadence of the change is exponential, and it's unrelenting. And we've been using Astro Teller's graph that he did a number of years ago about how when change occurred, particularly in technology, that we could adapt to it because there was such a gap. It allowed us to adapt because those changes were not, they took months or days, now it's seconds. And now that has eclipsed our ability to adapt. And so how do you, as a society or individuals or as an organization, get ahead of it? And the discussion at Ferguson today is how do we become more of a learning organization? How do we create a safe learning environment and we think we have people who are learners and who are curious, but how do we accelerate that? How do we make sure that we're learning the things we need to learn and learning faster so that as an organization we can adapt to the change that's going on in the world, we can recognize it, we can employ it. And that could be change that's imposed on us by the environment, by competition, disruptors, or whatever, or it can be change that we impose on ourselves where we think something is such a great idea that maybe the adaptable cultural timeline is no longer any good and we've got to move faster. So how do we do that? How do we incorporate that in what we do? And again, we're kind of going through this learning. What does it mean to be a learning organization? What does it mean to learn faster?
Well, I would agree with all of those comments. I'll add maybe when I thought of the question first, Brent, I thought about connectivity. So when I think of setting strategy, leadership role, right? You're sort of always thinking about how do you set the right vision? How do you create the architecture? How do you create the forum and policy so that your organization, your division, your department, whatever it is, can be successful? But part of what I've observed, and we've been doing it now 2x, right? As Larry said, we made an acquisition about 2 years ago, Family Dollar, that took us from $10 billion to just about $22 billion and 100,000 people and almost 200,000 people, is staying connected to the associate in the store or our associate in the distribution center If in my travels before this, I worked with a lot of other retailers, and you would go into these buildings and you'd find the special executive floor with the white carpet, right, and the Chippendale furniture, and no one else could get on the floor, right? And you think, how does that happen, right? Or you'd go into another corporate office and you find that there's a special room. You can have lunch as a special room executive. Those things get away from you quick if you're not diligent about it, thinking about where the most value is created for your business. And in our case, it's in 14,000 and change stores, where being connected with that associate. So we were with my family in Florida about 3-4 months ago, and we walked into a store, and our zone vice president, who runs part of that area of the country for us, likes to say, any Dollar Tree executive on vacation in Florida is a district manager, because we're always walking into stores going, there's a problem, there's a problem. But in this case, I walked into a store near Cocoa Beach, a small store. You'd never pick it out of a lineup if you were looking at a P&L report. And I rented a young part-time associate store manager named Jonathan. And it was late one night, about 7:30. I said, Jonathan, how's the store doing? And he knew everything, right? He knew how the business was doing. He knew where the open opportunities were. He knew his recovery problems. He knew his scheduling problems. I said, Jonathan, how did you get here? And he said, well, I joined as a cashier, and then they had an opening for part-time assistant store manager. I had to have it. And I'm paying for my college. I'm working my way up, and I want to run a store. I want to run a district. And you sort of walk out of that store going, how do I do that 15,000 times, right? And being connected with that individual, I think, and staying with it is a key part of how you do that at a scale. And I think about it a lot.
So for me, I can't imagine how to run an organization with how many hundreds of thousands of employees?
About 200,000.
200,000 employees. The two companies that I built combined had 170 employees. Now we were in a capital intensive business, not a labor intensive business. So it was about close to $3 billion in enterprise value. So we had very few employees, but a whole lot of cool equipment. And for us, the enormity was the complexity of what we were accomplishing. We, as Larry had said, we took an Exxon plant that was shut down. It had been idled because it was no longer economic, and spent about $600 million to convert it to a new process called propane dehydrogenation. And we did it in a way that had never been done before, and it was the largest plant of its kind in the world. So it was technically very complex. It was a private equity undertaking, which meant that we had to arrange for the financing, convince a lot of people that this made sense. We also had project finance, so we had loans from banks, and the banks were there every day asking for reports. And then we had to have customers, and we were doing all this during the financial crisis, which caused a few sleepless nights. When we went to start the plant up, it didn't work, and that was also disquieting. All these, when I talk about a plant, you know, this is huge equipment. It's one of a kind, and so when I say it didn't work, there was $70 million worth of engineering that went into building this thing, but all that engineering is not as precise as you would think when you're building something, a prototype. So it came up, it didn't work. We had to figure out how to make things work. We ended up having different problems. For us, for our team, and that was one of the unique things, you know, it's the Apollo 13 adage, failure was not an option. Well, it really wasn't. We had to make this thing work. Ultimately, we got it up and running, and it was working well. Shale gas happened at the same time, which really made our product, propylene, enormously profitable. It was It was 3 times as profitable as we had hoped or expected. So then we took the company public, and we took the company public as none of us at the company knew what it was like to run a public company. Just getting all the paperwork into the SEC and your accounting systems in place and all the other management systems that are necessary. So for us, it wasn't that we had 200,000 employees, but we had an awful lot of tasks for each employee to do, and a lot of complex activities to get that done. So it's a different type of, the enormous for us was not an enormous organization, but an enormous challenge.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So it's interesting because one of the things that came up, we've spoken ahead of time, and we talk, and what you've kind of highlighted also is this sense of urgency. Time frames are shrinking, and there seems to be a greater sense of urgency. I mean, as we talked, it was kind of the first 100 days idea. I mean, Trump's first 100 days just concluded, and obviously, and it was interesting, I read an article that said that's kind of an artifact. You know, what makes 100 days critical, but yet it's irrelevant now because people peg to 100 days. And as you mentioned, going IPO, there are certain expectations that change that are beyond your control. And so the question I wanted to ask was, how did you approach your first 100 days? And each of you have very different, responsibilities and projects, but how did you approach your first 100 days in your current capacity?
I'll go first.
Sure. Well, I guess the first question I asked myself was, am I here to affect change? Because depending on that answer, I sort of have done it one of 2 ways. And I'll sort of liken it to starting the job and the role, and once we just immediately closed the transaction and acquisition of Family Dollar. So 2 very different moments in time for me professionally. When joining the company, my sort of decision was I'm here to sort of absorb, right? So unlike the current administration, I was not being held publicly either for the scrutiny or what I accomplished. So it was really to come in and digest it, right? So I think about pace a lot when you join an organization at a very senior and large scale, because you can make things happen quickly and they're wrong things to go do. I'll give you an example. I was probably 3 months into the job. I was invited to a meeting, and I was sitting there silently observing it, and they were presenting to me an update on a project, and I thought, well, this is interesting. It must have started before I got here, so I'm just going to take it all in. Then a second meeting, different project. Then a third meeting, different project. And a young woman, Julie's presenting to me, and I said, Julie, I've just got to stop you for a second, and what sort of started this project? And she said, well, we heard you wanted to do this. And I sort of said, well, that's terrific, and let me think about that. So it occurred to me driving home the following week that I had started those projects on the way to the cafe. Somebody would stop me in the hallway and say, Mike, here's a question. And I would say, well, that is a terrific question. And a project would start. Right? So I turned to the president at the time and I said, Gary, does this happen to you? He goes, I do not talk in the hallway anymore. As part of this. Because it depends where you walk and something would happen. Now, it's a culture wound for action, so that's a bit of it, but sort of supports the sort of come in and relax, absorb a little bit. The exact opposite is true. As we closed the transaction, we had a lot of time to plan for the closing of Family Dollar. And during that time period, we had built a plan and sat down and said, I've got a 100-day plan, gathered the top leadership the week we closed within 3 days and said, here's the plan, let's execute. And take no prisoners and get it done as fast as you can, because our objective was to effect change quickly in that case, and held ourselves to it and more beyond that in the first 100 days. So I think important for me when I think about where do you start is the answer to that first question.
All right. Excellent.
So as I reflect on some of my experience, the other business that we built was a storage and transportation business in the petrochemical area based in Louisiana. And we bought that business out of the Williams companies. And so we bought it for $30 million. It had $3 million of cash flow. Ultimately, we turned it into something that had $70 million of cash flow and sold it for $625 million. What we did, though, was we turned it from a cost center into a profit center. And those are very different animals. In a cost center, it's okay to tell your customer no, because your customer is the same company. When you're in the business that I'm in, which is the land of giants, is what I call it. Exxon, BASF, Dow, these huge companies. You have to be customer oriented, and that was the change that we needed to effect from day one. Is that we can never the rule that we transmitted throughout the organization is we can never let anyone go down. And what that meant is we were supplying feedstocks and taking products out of major petrochemical facilities. These are multi-billion-dollar facilities, and whether someone has a contract at the Williams companies, if there wasn't a contract in place, you weren't allowed to make a movement. And that was because they were concerned about getting paid. Well, it was pennies that you were getting paid, and if you shut a major facility down, nobody's ever going to do business with you. So we really had to change this focus that we would never tell a customer no. And the way we were able to achieve this high growth rate is because almost instantly everybody felt comfortable that they could rely on us, and so they would give us more business because they could rely on us. So the key theme had to be from day one. We were gonna do what customers needed, and we'd figure the rest out later. In our propylene business, which was converting the plant, this was a huge construction project. We had 1,000 construction workers on site at peak, and then we introduced hydrocarbons, and hydrocarbons, if you're not careful, can do bad things. So what was the most important element for us was that nobody was going to get hurt, and that was the key theme from day one. Nobody was going to get hurt, and the way we accomplished that was every employee was empowered to stop any work or any activity that looked to be unsafe, and they knew that we meant that because when you examine safety issues, it all goes back to that problem that people get in a rush. But ultimately, that was what we had to do in the first 100 days, was make sure everybody who was coming to the site understood no one was going to get hurt.
So I took over as CEO of Ferguson in 2009, and in the fall of 2009. And we, at the time, had 16,000 associates. In 2007, we'd had 24,000 associates. And for those of you who don't know the business we're in, it's the contractor, consumer, but it's everything to do with construction, dealing with municipalities, governments. But when the world collapsed at the end of 7, all of 8, we moved very quickly as an organization to rationalize, but this was cultural shock to us because we have never been through anything like this before. We have never, laying people off was never part of our history. So here we are in 2009, and we're a bruised organization. Are we going to be relevant in the future? Is this a good space to be in? How do we recruit college trainees to come into an industry that's been beat up so badly? And so my first 90 days, I went out in the field and I met with 250 managers. I took the CFO and the COO and the head of HR. And we made a point of sitting in chairs in kind of a horseshoe shape and let them have it, vent, share frustrations. But it was about putting our arms around it and just listening. We came with no plan, people first, strategy second, we told them. And, what do we need to do to move forward? How are we going to be successful? And how do we define ourselves as an organization? Because we're not a family anymore. We're different. And how do we emerge from this a better company, a more high performance company, but keep all the elements, all the good things from our history and our past culture that we want to endure, forever. So we talked, then we started surveying all associates, and we asked the innovative questions, what do we keep, what do we lose, what do we adopt, what is it we need to do? We're open to anything. We went to Cornell and said, we want you to start surveying our associates every 6 months. And we want to start understanding engagement scores and making sure that we're in line and tune with our associates. Then we reached out to customers after the first 30 days, our large customers, and this was we had lots of listening posts, but we had senior management calls, some of the larger ones. We had people, our sales force in the field, start collecting information. We wanted listening results, not results of making a sales call. I mean, we'd still take an order if they gave it to us, but what is important to you as a customer? What are you seeking? Because they're hurting. And their dependence and reliance on us actually has increased because they need more services now because they have cut back and they're not going to keep inventory and they have working capital issues. And then we went to the vendor community, and we've always had a very good, I heard the panel earlier, but our relationships with our vendors are very important, and vendors are very important in their brands in our space. And we went to them, and they're concerned, and their associates are concerned about, is there going to be disintermediation? Is Ferguson going to put more heat on you to take cost out, and that means we're going to have to do other things differently? And the discussion with them was not a sourcing discussion, it was how do we grow together? What are we going to do to be even better than we were in the past? And then after that, we said, okay, so we put together roughly 30 people who represented all disciplines within the organization. So every department, every channel, every branch, every operational feature was represented. And we said, okay, let's take the information that we heard and balance it against the performance that we want to achieve. Listen to stakeholders and let's figure out what we're going to do. And then come up with overarching strategies that we will use moving forward, and we're still using today, as the litmus test for anything that we do. If it doesn't fit in here, then we're not going to do it. And I think out of that, we now have ongoing engagement results and scores, but we also started measuring customer sentiment, and again, it moved from anecdotal to something more structured. And if you're familiar with Net Promoter Score, so we measure those often. So anything we do, we kind of know what the feeling and sentiment is of our associates and our customers, and if we're moving in the right direction, and what are the opportunities to do different things and be better than we were in the past. So,
well, thank you. This is interesting because across even all three of the comments, we hear obviously an employee-based issue comments as far as hiring and listening and other things. And so it's interesting because when you look at today's environment, just 2 days ago, the Labor Department announced the unemployment rate at 4.3, the lowest in something like 15 years. Yet wages are not increasing, which kind of says there's not pressure on one side, but and what we find is there are millions of highly skilled jobs going unfilled because we don't have the skill set. And so we have some real interesting challenges. And so a question I wanted to pose to you is with regards to how do you hire the right people? And recognize that we have really three different types of business models. We have a capital intensive kind of factory type of situation. We have retail and then a B2B type business. In our discussion just before we started, we talked about Chick-fil-A and how you can go to Chick-fil-A and you have teenagers that they say my pleasure when you say thank you, and they seem to mean it. And so the question I would like to pose, and I know that Mike had said this in an earlier call, phone call we had, which is your associates are the face of the brand. Another colleague that I had to speak to in one of my MBA classes says, he said, I can walk into any business and within 10 seconds know how these employees are being managed. Tell you about the manager, not the employee, by my first interaction with in the company. So I wanted to kind of throw out a broad question of how do you attract, hire, and retain the right people? And how do you inculcate the company culture you want to have be lived by those individuals and such?
So for us, when we were hiring, we were building an organization, and one of the things that I found in my experience there are lots of people who can be plugged into an organization and a system and do very well. It's a more unique skill to know how to build a system. So we had a CFO who needed to put together, a whole cost accounting system for our company, and then had to figure out how to take us public. And she was fantastic at that. So we had a whole host of positions that we needed people who were so familiar with their area of responsibility that they knew from day one, here's the resources I need. And so consequently, we needed very skilled people. We didn't hire anybody who didn't have 20 years of experience, and it was simply that was what we were looking for. Once we had a cadre of employees, one of the rules we liked to stick by was hiring people who one of us had worked with previously. Couldn't always do that, but even nobody's perfect, but having people where their strengths and weaknesses, as opposed to the wild card often of the interview process, was of value. Ultimately, the way we attracted people in a very tough hiring environment, because the petrochemical industry is in tremendous expansion. One, we got them excited about the company. So I would interview every prospective employee, not because I was necessarily evaluating them, but I was working to excite them about this unique thing that we were doing. So being part of the biggest plant of its kind in the world and a new animal was very exciting to a lot of people. And then finally, every employee at our company had stock in the company. So that was a huge motivator, and it was especially once we went into operation, because our company was a master limited partnership, so we paid out all our cash flow. So everybody knew, our plant produced $1 million a day of cash flow, and if the plant went down, it would take us a day and a half to get it back up. So everybody knew, I can make a huge impact on this business, and it will come back to me every quarter. So that whole package is what allowed us to attract some pretty talented folks.
I would say, to your point of scale, we hire a lot of people. I was just checking the numbers. I think we hired a little over 4,000 people last week.
I bet you don't interview. I bet you don't interview everyone.
I interview most myself. So I just got here, and anyway. But in scale, so obviously we have to apply somewhat different rules based on where we're hiring.
Right.
So when you get out across the country, we spend a lot of time trying to build the right assessment and profile for a successful person for our company. So as I said, Brent, on the call, the store is the product, the engagement and interaction you have with the associate is how you experience what we do for a living. And if the person can do it in 10 minutes, I'd like to know who he is. I might hire him as part of it, because there's always something to learn in that. But when we put the assessments together, we looked for a couple of things, and not the least of which was customer friendly. And we did that based on modeling and interviewing about 1,000 of our own associates, trying to find people and successful stores with successful customer scores, because we do index that, try to understand how a customer feels about that store. And when we found the traits of the people who worked in those stores, we said that's sort of what we want to find, right? We want to find people who will say hello, are excited to be there, the Jonathans of Florida, and are excited about their career opportunities. We get to the corporate office, it's a little more complicated, right? There's a lot more dialogue about how many levels do you have and how many weeks of vacation do I get, and do I get equity, don't I get equity, and all those are important. But then engagement, so you use the word hire, train, retain. I like to use the word engagement. Retain sounds like restrain. But engagement, right? How do you get people to be successful? Think about enabling them to do everything they can do and be excited about it every day. And that is part of the biggest challenge at scale that we have, is it's how you brand the back room in our case. So when you walk in the back room of a Dollar Tree or Family Dollar, not everyone, we're working on it. You'd see a poster about career opportunity. It looks like a baseball card, right, that shows someone who's now in charge of a district of a $20 million business who started as a part-time cashier, right, and it shows the jobs they had. Was a part-time cashier, assistant store manager, then ran as an assistant district manager, then a district manager, and here's who they are, here's their picture, and here's the phone number if you want to call them, right, so people can see and connect that there's something here for me, right, I'm not just here as a cog in the machine for the organization. And again, that gets easier. I'm going to put a plug in for the business school here. In the corporate office, we spend a lot of time looking at our talent and invest and send them to places to learn and develop and try to engage for their own benefit. Because the value we get as professionals, I think, is there's the job and the responsibilities, and hopefully you like what you get paid, but you want to be professionally growing in and on your own. And so to find a forum for that, and so I like to think, I called Larry a couple of years ago and said to Dean Pulley, do you have a program like this? He said, well, of course we do. Maybe two, all of a sudden. Things to choose from. So we're very involved with the business school here and sending some of our best and brightest to keep them sort of completely engaged. But frankly, it's an investment that pays for our company, because if we can make them excited and successful professionally, they know we're investing in them. And from there, they stay. They're more excited to be there and do what they're doing, and they get better skills. So, scale in one sense. On the other hand, a very personalized touch is part of it. So,
Right.
Yeah, so for us, and we've had a training program for, I guess since 1970 when I started. It's interesting. So when I graduated here in August, I started in Raleigh, North Carolina. This was 41 years ago, at our branch there, and it was a training branch. And everybody starts in the warehouse, and the warehouse manager, I introduced myself, and he said, this is after my wife had dropped me off at 6 in the morning. And she worked on Wall Street, but she got a job as a teller in Raleigh. She's very excited. She said, it's either stupidity or love. I don't know which one. So the warehouse manager, very gruff individual, said, hey, and he did not like higher education. He said, I want you to work in the yard and blah, 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 and start cleaning up and putting pipe away and all this kind of stuff. So I started doing that. Then he said, hey, hotshot, come here. And I said, yes, sir. And I came over, and he said, you got an MBA, don't you? I said, well, yeah, from William & Mary, no less. And he goes, why don't you go ahead and mow the grass? We'll move you up a little bit. So it was a big day in my life. This year, that ends in July, we will hire 400 college graduates from 32 universities. And for us, when people want a career, they join a culture. And if you want a job, if somebody comes in and says, this is kind of my beginning of my journey of 5 to 6 jobs before I settle in, you're looking for a company, not a culture. So it has to be about a good fit. Do you want to be relevant? Do you want to contribute? Do you want to be successful? And success can be defined differently among the 4 generations that work for us. So that's okay. But do you want to have an opportunity to grow and be successful in life? And what can we do to help you get there? So it's a very long and arduous and expensive process. So when we bring in 400, we want 400 here 5, 10 years from now. This is not about culling out the 10% that don't make it. But we want them comfortable with us. So there's a lot of on-site. You meet senior people, you meet local people. And then from there, we have a very good formalized training process at the local level, at the district level, and then at corporate level. And we call it cultures and values. After you've been with us a year, we bring in groups of 30 at a time, and trainees for a week at headquarters. And a lot of us get in front of them, and it's more Q&A than anything else. But it's to hear how you doing. For a lot of these folks, it's their first job, maybe first time away from home. Is it okay to feel the way I feel? And should I question things and all that? And so, it demonstrates, that we're interested in them, and which we are, but we also want to continue to focus on how they develop. So they have informal and formal mentors. Then we start doing school programs as they move up within the organization. And finally, when you're at this most senior level, for 12 years now, we've been sending one person, their 2 sessions a year to the Harvard AMP program. So that means you've either moved into something or you're going to. That's kind of the signal. Because a lot of our people grow up in our company, and we want to make sure that, we get outside our world, not just through those programs, but just through this learning piece. For us, it's a huge relationship business. So it is about people skills. It's about how you communicate. It's about thinking critically. It's about having a value proposition that frames your behavior and how you act and do things. And are you a curious person? Do you get out of your world? We say, don't be the most boring person at a cocktail party where you can only talk about one thing. So expand, challenge yourself. And then we bring in people from acquisitions. And we tell the acquisition folks, and with acquisitions, it's the same thing. It's not bricks and mortar acquisition. It's a cultural connection. So we spend a lot of time. We've done it, we don't do that big an acquisition, but we've done $1.5 billion in the last 5 or 6 years. And the thing we want the acquisition to be is comfortable with us, and we want to be comfortable with them. So there's great transparency on both sides, because these are family businesses. It's the first time they've sold. But, as we tell them, and it's true, we're better off when they bring something different to us. And we tell the trainees or anybody within the organization that, we want to live by this fear status quo more than you fear change, because it enriches us. So whether our culture changes, I don't know, but we're enriched by these different people coming in, young, older, from different companies. Our challenge, just from an editorial point of view on labor, is at the driver level, CDL driver. And this touches into what our customers are going through. There is a huge labor shortage in the construction industry. I don't know if and it's changing behaviors. So our customers, for example, we noticed 6 months ago that our counter sales seemed to be leveling off, and they weren't keeping up with the year-on-year growth. And we're going, what the heck's going on? Well, our customers don't have enough people to send them to the counter. And they need to be on the job site and call in, or use mobile to get in, which is fine. It's a shift in behavior, but that's okay, because if we're in front of it, it's a value add that we can create and fill the void, because in the absence of us doing it, somebody else will. But at the contractor level within our industry, and at the driver level with us, because CDL drivers are very sought after, it's very difficult right now.
Well, excellent. As to stick with this idea of the enormous, one of the things we were talking about is kind of this issue of sometimes people see managing a large versus a nimble company as being mutually exclusive. And our original example we were talking about was kind of Apple versus Tesla, but even with GM in the news this week, kind of struggling, almost falling behind Ford, maybe it's a GM versus a Tesla issue. And so the question I wanted to ask, because again we have 3 different scale, 200,000 employees versus 170, but capital intensive versus labor intensive. So your thoughts on kind of managing a large, well, I guess the main question is managing large versus a nimble organization, does it have to be mutually exclusive? And if no, how do you effectively manage the balance between the two?
You want that one, Nathan?
Sure, I'll go for it. So, there's no choice in my organization for the large part, but the important balance that we needed to achieve was you can be nimble, and one of the things we did do is we hired from a whole bunch of different companies. One thing about the petrochemical and hydrocarbon processing industries is, Dow, there's a lot of people who used to work at Dow, but there's nobody at Dow that's ever worked anywhere else. Same thing for Exxon, same thing for Shell. We had an organization that was made up of a whole bunch of different people from all these different companies, and that was fantastic because it provided an opportunity to cross-fertilize and figure out who was doing the system the best and adopting that as a framework. So we were a very nimble organization, but our big challenge was to make sure, again, hydrocarbons are tough to work with and you don't want to get anybody hurt, to make sure we had the right controls in place so that we didn't make changes that, you don't want to open a valve that shouldn't be opened. And that's an example, but it was, bureaucracies and systems are really important, and it's having that right balance of not being too nimble to the point that you make a mistake. So that was our challenge. Was we were plenty nimble, but we needed to make sure we weren't too nimble.
Well, I'd offer it has to be a core part of our values, isn't it, being nimble. And the benefit being distributed business, meaning all the 14 or so thousand store locations. We were talking about this earlier, and what I mean by nimble is we're reacting to every market. And couple of examples, one of the ways I think about it is, we have the ability to put a graduation relevant color set. So the plates and the napkins and the streamers in every store relative to the high school nearby, right? Over almost 10,000 locations. It took us a little work to get there. But I mean, this hue of blue, this hue of maroon, this gold, but allows your customers sort of know that you care and you listen and you're thinking about what they need as opposed to something sort of broader and macro. But at the same time, we're always looking for something that people didn't know they needed. Right? We often talk about at the Dollar Tree side of the business, not the family Dollar Tree side more, is we carry a bunch of stuff, nothing of what you really need. But don't stop shopping, by the way. That's part of that. But if you go in and it's seasonally relevant, and meaning you walk in and you'll know in the first 10 feet that we want to be really relevant to what you're doing for Father's Day or for July 4th or for graduation events and all those things. So what you find is you'll find little plastic things. We talk about these little plastic solar dancing caricatures. I don't know how many of you have seen them. They started as a flower, by the way, and it started as a flower from a taxi ride overseas on a buying trip, where one of our buyers was saying, what is I've seen these all, what is that thing? And they said, it's a solar flower thing, it runs with the sun. We said, well, take it. And we sold 3 million quickly. We've sold more than 60 million of them since we put them out, right? And you do not need, well, again, don't stop buying them, but you don't need a plastic flower solar thing, right, as part of it. But it's finding those exciting things that allow us to react to the market. We were talking about reading glasses earlier. So I don't know how many of you need reading glasses here. I see a hand or two. Well, we sell almost 1 million a week for $1. So that isn't a business that anybody would have said, boy, why would you do that? And thinking, well, the market sort of needs it, let's jump in. Now we tested it. We can test it in 5 stores, then go to 10 stores, maybe 500 stores. We can try it in California. We could try it in Florida. We could try it in Boston. We can try it even in Canada. 5 Canadian provinces, right, where we have a couple hundred stores. And if it takes off and the customers love it, then we'll react and we go. Right? And we can go to the left half of the country, the right half of the country, you get my point, right, as part of that. By the same token, some of the discipline required when you make other changes is very different. So if you want to change vacation policy for 200,000 people, you get my point already. You got to take your time. You got to think about that, right? It is, well, how does that work? You want to go to engineered standards. So we've got that in half of our supply chain and warehouses, as Frank was commenting, warehouse are thinking about. We spend a lot of time. We got about 6,000 people in 20 or so warehouses around the country, and we've got half with engineered standards and the other half getting engineered standards. You got to go person by person. How's that going to affect the individual, and how do I think about that? And now I'm going to apply it to 6,000 people who have 5 people at home, who have people they're caring for, have a mortgage to make. And how do you sort of apply that carefully? So I would think about it on the store side that you sort of need to be both. I don't think they can be exclusive in this day and age. But there are certainly times where you take one more than the other as part of that.
Yeah, so we feel like, we always talk about, hey, it's nice to be a big company, but let's not do some things big companies do, and that is move slowly. So we don't wait till something is 60 or 70 or 80% ready if we've got a good indication. So while we want to be nimble, we really want to be agile when we introduce something to understand how we need to change or improve or stop it along the way. We went through really a transformational change 3 years ago where we essentially blew up the organization saying, how are we going to get to, as big as you are? How are we going to go from 15 to 25 billion? We're not set up to be that way. So we went through a whole, changed everything across the country. And it started with, the genesis for it was a pilot and the branch didn't know it was a pilot. They were doing it on their own, but they changed the way they serviced the customer and set up the branches and did these really neat creative things. Well, if it worked there, then it's going to work everywhere. Now, maybe there's some nuances associated with geographies or markets and that kind of thing, but essentially we weren't going to run 10 pilots to validate whether this is going to work or not. And we're also, I don't think the lack of arrogance, if we made a mistake or we need to stop or adjust or amend or whatever, which we did along the way, it was supposed to be a 5-year project. We did it in 2 years. But the big thing about anything change moving forward, and you touched on it, it's about what does it mean to me? So never think that you're communicating enough, because any change is personal. It's not a corporate change. It's not about structure and organizational charts. It's about how does it affect me as an individual. And the reason we moved faster was we didn't realize as we were doing this sequential rollout geographically that those who were going to be on year 4 or 5 felt displaced, behind. Is somebody getting ahead of me? What's going on? Why are we, and they said, bring it on. So we brought it on.
Excellent.
And, yeah.
No, it's interesting because again, when we look at these questions, we start, as I said, that we're talking about is there's a lot of commonality that across almost all the questions when you start talking about size and scale, people and other things. And one question that continues to pop up in the literature and other things is how you manage you mentioned 4 generations in the organization. How do you manage effectively the different generations? We talk about millennials, but it's interesting as I talk with my students. I had this last semester. I had an older student in the millennial group, and he said he's very different than the younger. So millennials aren't millennials in the sense that if you're 35 versus 21, and so he even viewed it as very different within his class, that he would be managed very different or would manage differently than the others. So how do you effectively manage across generations or generations, but also especially with the expectations of the new generation coming up? It doesn't necessarily mean right or wrong. I often refer to it as the participation trophy generation, but there's no right or wrong. It's more just it's a different approach to expectations, work ethic, and other things.
Throw it back.
I'm going first again.
You're the man.
So, my thinking, I only have some anecdotal evidence. As I say, we had an organization that was principally, people with tons of experience, but we deliberately had a group of operators that we hired straight out of school, because we can't have everybody retiring at the same time. So we brought in a group of operators who were young and we were training. And then in our accounting group, it was principally made up of millennials. And so a small sampling, at least from my perspective, I don't really, I think there's no grand difference. I think it's just, the older generation says we walked uphill both ways to school, and that's really what we see when we talk about millennials. I mean, I can tell you, our accounting group, when we were going public, we were on our road show, and in the middle of selling stock and going public. And because propylene, so our business bought propane and we turned it into propylene and sold propylene and made the margin between those two commodities. And we used a third-party consultant to provide a forecast for those commodity prices. We didn't want to be responsible for forecasting the commodity price. And that's what we put in our S1, the prospectus that everybody gets. And it turned out that the consultant that came up with that forecast changed their forecast in the middle of our roadshow. And we had to change our S1. So on a Wednesday morning, we found out this was happening, and we had to go through this 300-page document. And I say we, it wasn't me, it was these 25-year-olds who worked nonstop until it was done, and we filed with the SEC, and they had to approve it before we could go public on Friday. So this was a back against the wall situation, and we had a team of really young people who did the right thing. And so I will tell you, in a company with the right culture where everybody's pulling in the same direction and doing what needs to be done, millennials are just like the older generations.
I feel we're probably, oddly as it may sound, with as many people as we have, really going through this point of inflection now, addressing, I've lost track of the letters. I know there's a Gen X, a Gen Y. Is there a Z? There might be a Z.
I think
No
we
Z
just
yet?
jumped straight to millennials.
Straight to millennials. And I'm not even sure where you draw the line. Let's just sort of think about it as, sort of new professionals or people who are building and then starting their careers versus people with 20 years of hard work and dedication. And a couple of things that really stuck out as we've addressed this and thought about it organizationally. The first is there's a sense of immediacy. And it sort of stems from something Frank said a minute ago about communication and I think it's the world the younger professionals have grown up in. It's on your phone. 7 minutes ago, I know if a dog got off its leash, right? I mean, everything is in front of me all the time. And that sets an expectation of immediacy in the organization of, right now, tell me what you're thinking. Well, per my earlier comments, you don't want to do that very frequently. And that can create an interesting dynamic between the folks who are hard at work and say, this is what I love to do. I get up every day, and this is what I'm passionate about. And I want to do this forever, right? They're 20 years, they're good at it, they're experienced at it, they're passionate about it. And the younger generation is sort of coming in, by the way, career paths should look like a diamond, right? I mean, come out and get some real experience and then sort of settle in and decide when you want to focus and sort of major as you go forward. So you're still going broad. And what we wrestle with is that immediacy and when's my next title coming, right? You've all probably heard that before from folks who are starting out. LinkedIn has not helped, right? Because LinkedIn means you'll be sitting there working really well, and you hear a ping sound, and your friend down the street just got a new senior attached to their title, and now we're late. Right, as part of it, going, why don't I have a senior? I want a senior. And we're in that point of inflection because we think of our organizational as you must keep it flat, right? It isn't about leaders. It's not the white carpet, right? It's everybody's sleeves rolled up and more people who are engaged with the customer, with our distribution centers, and a lot less people sitting around a store support center. So we don't have a lot of levels. So we're wrestling with that now that we've got another 1,000 people in Charlotte who are asking that very similar question. Just as a point of difference, when we acquired the Family Dollar business, they had 6 more levels in the organization than we did at Dollar Tree. And it was all in titles. It wasn't about whether they were great or not great. They were sort of a lot of talented people. But they were sort of doling out titles to address this problem, right? We had an associate, a senior associate, an analyst, a senior analyst, a manager, an associate manager, senior manager, and I wish I made some of those up. A lot of titles, right? And at some point you go, but what do you do? And I sort of believe philosophically, if on Monday you come in and do the same thing you were doing on Friday, then you don't need a different title as part of it. But people do that, right? Because they're addressing this immediacy in the younger generation. That's not a flaw, by the way. That's just sort of what's evolving, I think, as people get used to the immediacy of everything, the information that's flowing at you. I found out my friend is a senior super duper person and I got to be one, right, as part of it. So we're wrestling with it. I don't know there's a perfect answer. other than reminding people that great work will return great results and you'll be rewarded for doing it, right? Sort of the basic principles of how to build a great company. But it's changing rapidly, and I'm not sure what it looks like a year from now, by the way, as you sort of ask it, Brent. But.
Yeah, so it is for us a multi-generational question because you have baby boomers who may not be tech savvy and millennials tech savvy. How do we make that connection and make everybody feel relevant and contributing? I mentioned earlier about how they define success, and I also agree that I think the millennials that are coming into our company are very similar to the YX and the baby boomers, but they bring something different, and that's okay because we're used to this pace of bringing in new people and changing, and we feel like it makes us better. One of the things that we found out was they want feedback. Millennials want more feedback than perhaps we did. Just do your job, good things will happen, give me my annual performance review. So we're getting ready to introduce 4 performance reviews a year. And they're not going to be as clunky and whatever, but that's what people want. Well, we're going to do that for the whole organization. That's going to be a good thing. So all of our associates will be having a meaningful conversation, a formal meaningful conversation, instead of one time a year. Now there's constant feedback and that kind of thing. So recognition. And also things that we have been doing forever, now we start maybe celebrating more or being more open about. But for us, community involvement and community leadership is very important. And it's not just about supporting financially, it's about rolling up your sleeves and being involved. That's part of leadership. Well, we've always done that, but we've never talked about it because that's what we do, and we feel like it's it's bragging or being arrogant or something. But they want to know that, and that's part of the conversation, that cultural discussion that goes on when we interview people. What are you doing? What are you interested in? But the fundamental things about achievement and success and wanting a company that allows me the opportunities to grow, and can I still be, I heard this once, that being entrepreneurial has changed a little bit in its definition, and being entrepreneurial is what is your service to the community and service to others, as opposed to what are you doing, what's your new widget in the marketplace. So again, we haven't seen anything that threatens us or makes us feel uncomfortable. It's just the way the world evolves and society evolves, and it's okay. It will make us better.
Oh, excellent. Well, it's interesting, and what I would like the audience to be thinking about is we're going to open it up for Q&A in just a minute, because we have such a great opportunity, and you have questions from your own experience and other thoughts. So as you are thinking of the questions you may would like to ask our panelists, I did want to throw out one last quick question to go through, which is, what keeps you up at night?
You want me to go first on this one?
Yeah, why don't you go first?
I'll start first.
Okay.
There's a long list. No.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Fred.
All right. Yeah, so I heard this mentioned in the earlier panel. All companies go through risk assessments a couple of times a year, and the one that's emerged for us, and I think, for us, we call them managed risk, but that seems to be teeter-tottering on something beyond our control, and I think that's affecting everybody, is cybersecurity. And how do we eliminate the weaknesses in our security perimeter? That's our focus. But unfortunately, it seems to be there are no answers or solutions right now. It's more, what can you do to mitigate the enormity of it? And it's also a huge void in terms of labor shortage. Just in Virginia alone, I've heard numbers between 17 and 36,000 cybersecurity openings. If anybody's here, we could use 13 more. We have 15, and so I think that's a challenge for, at least for us, and what it can literally, and we're a country of laws and businesses with rules, and the anonymity that allows people to do things just creates distrust in everything, and so that's also a concern.
I guess I would mirror all of that. I would say the thing that I think a lot about is what should I know that I don't know? Sort of get up every morning thinking about that. And it's the span of it is, it can be about security, cybersecurity, certainly think a lot about that, and with all the touch points we have for credit cards. I think about it in our distribution centers. I think about it in the stores. I think about it, who's a great talent that we haven't recognized that is coming in the morning thinking about, this is my last day, I don't want to be here, that we haven't thought about, haven't seen. What business issue that has yet to come up that our competition is doing that I haven't had time to find, right? So when you get to scale, you sort of think about, you can get so consumed with what comes across your desk every day. It's, what don't I know that I should know as part of that.
Well, we sold our public company to Coke, the Koch brothers, a couple of years ago, so I sleep great at night. But when I was running a public company, what was really challenging is all the different directions as CEO that you get pulled in. The investors want to hear from the CEO. They don't want to hear from an investor relations person. When they call, when they have a question, when there's a problem, they want to hear from the CEO. They want to hear from you because you know what's going on in the operation. So you have to know what's going on in the operation. And we had a big machine that would demand attention. If it wasn't running right, we had to fix it. And then we had an obligation as a public company to grow. I mean, if you're not going to grow, you shouldn't go public. So, we had a whole series of growth initiatives that we were working on and pushing forward. And then once a quarter, you have to sign this document that says if anything in there is wrong, you're going to go to jail. I mean, it was the sum total of all these different directions that you get pulled in. The joke I used to make was, if I didn't have to do all these things for the public company, I could actually run the business. And it was so that's what used to keep me up at night was all the things that I didn't do that day that I was supposed to.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you very much. So we basically have two mics that are roaming the room on either side. If you have a question you would like to have the panelists ask, please raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you and see what they have to say.
Hi, Mike Heath, 2009 MBA. How do you feel the new administration's anti-globalization policies will affect your businesses respectively and affect the U.S. economy in general?
Shall I go first?
Please.
One area that Trump's rhetoric is focused on is, for example, with when a couple of the big pipeline projects were finally approved, he said it had to be done with U.S. steel, with steel made in the United States. Steel is a worldwide business. There's tons of different grades of steel, and lots of it is not made in the U.S. There are when we were building our plant, we had equipment fabricated in Malaysia, where the steel came out of the UK, and there was not one place in the United States that we could get this particular equipment made. So the activity is a global one. And then most of the petrochemicals that we manufacture in the U.S. are going overseas. So it is so important, at least to my industry, that there not be any walls put up I think a lot of it is just not appreciating the integrated nature of many of these highly engineered activities.
I'll offer as a broader statement on retail, because retail as an industry spends a lot of time on this topic on the Hill, trying to influence how the business tax might actually happen or not happen. And a lot of what we're trying to help the administration understand, whether they're open to it or not, trying to help them understand is actually how that trickles down into the consumer's pocket. Right? There's an assumption that it's going to be terrific for the consumer on the end, but if you ask any retailer, they would tell you that's not true. And I don't just mean because in my Dollar Tree side I can only charge $1, I can't charge $1.05, but Family Dollar's price points can change. But there's an estimate that prices could go up by 30 to 70% in some of these goods. But if you start at the other end of the spectrum, you say, what do we want as a consumer? What do we find valuable? Then the whole thing starts to unwind quickly. If you start to put conditions or taxes on the business of the products we bring in, then it's going to end up right back into the pockets of people, frankly, who, in our Family Dollar business, it's a needs-based customer. This is a customer who gets off the train every day, might have a bag with them, fills their bag up and goes to their apartment and goes to work the next day and does it again. This isn't somebody who's sitting around with an extra $50 in their pocket who can hopefully pay for this. So we're doing everything we can, I tell you, as an industry to help the administration know that it could be very damaging to the customer at the end of the process.
For us, about 6-7% of our sales is own brand or private label that we source overseas. We have an office in Taipei, and we source throughout Asia. So what does a tariff mean to that? What is it going to do with pricing? And pricing in our industry does flow through. So when there are increases, it ends up in the consumer's lap. But for us, does that change the dynamic on sourcing product overseas, and how does it impact the pricing? But for now, there's nothing in place, and there's nothing we can do until we have a better idea of that. But anything else, there is no regulation around our parent company. We're domiciled in Switzerland for tax reasons. If suddenly the corporate tax came down, that might change. So from a positive, I guess that would. Ferguson pays its taxes, by the way. This is just intercompany. Didn't want anybody. We pay our U.S. taxes.
Two questions, and maybe mostly directed at Mike, given the structure of your business, but maybe also Frank. The first one for Mike directly: what's coming after the spinners?
Have you seen the whale with the bubbles yet? Well, get excited.
You'll understand the reason for the question in a second, but I'm in K-12 education, so we have a lot of them to sell you back from collecting them in classes. But more importantly, at least for you two guys, what do you see in terms of the impacts on your business or your employees, even in your stores? You're very geographically diverse, of kind of the state of K-12 education. How does that impact what you do and what you see over the years in retail and in your particular business?
The state of public education? That's a very good question. I've never been asked. I would answer it this way, kind of differently in terms of from a cultural point of view. The Hispanic population, we have a large Hispanic population that is in our organization, and we have found, by the nature of our training and what we do and our structure, that we're able to bring in people who may not have had and speak the English language like we do, but so we've been able to work through that, and we are a bilingual company now, which is good. But I've never seen a deficiency in. They may not have a formal education or a high school education, and that's everybody of any color. But they're intelligent. They want to be successful, and our organization is not one that looks at a CV. You can have institutional, I won't call it success and grow up in our company. And the senior vice president of supply chain, and really the transformational supply chain structure he put in place, did not go to college. We offer, if somebody comes to us and wants to continue their education, we do that at any level. And in fact, we have several IS5 students here who are doing the weekend program. So it's very important to us, but it has not limited or prevented anybody from, overcoming that, because they're still basically have the same drive and intelligence, and they just haven't had the opportunity or exposure like others that may have had.
I would first let me say teachers are a very important customer, so thank you for that. There's a lot of things in your schools that we're...
You're always on your game.
I really am. Who else needs... That's right. They are tough customers. This part. Fair enough. And as Frank said, I'm certainly not an expert on the broader educational system, but I would mirror something that Frank just shared. Retail is one of those unique industries nowadays where it's not required to have a college education. Grocery actually sort of does that a lot, by the way. People come out of high school and they end up at the meat counter, and then they run part of a department, then they run part of a store, and they grow from there. You can find that frequently. Actually, when we recruit, you see that occasionally, right? And I love people who have been with their hands at the deli counter, right? Or somebody who's been in the store and grew up that way. The gentleman who runs our stores at Family Dollar, we often joke he was born in the back room. I mean, he's been there 35 years. He started as a cashier, didn't have a college education, and has risen to run 8,000 plus locations, and he's terrific at it. So I would sort of mirror what Frank said. I don't find it as restriction by any means, and we'll sort of welcome bright people are bright people. Right? Not everybody has the same opportunity for education that all of us in this room, quite frankly, have had in that case, but we found them to be very successful when we can find the right folks.
And I will tell you, one of the interesting things facing the hydrocarbon processing industries on the Gulf Coast right now is a shortage of welders in particular. Welding is an incredible skill. Those who do it well, it's really amazing to watch. And there's just not enough welders, and there's not enough operators in our industry. And typically, to be an operator, you have to have completed high school, and then the community colleges along the Gulf Coast will have a 2-year program, and then where you'll learn basic processing information, and then you go get trained by a company, whoever you go to work for. But there's a tremendous shortage. The average age of an operator in the industry is 50 years old. So what I see is, and these are people who, once they get some experience, will be making $100,000 a year. And so the irony is there's so many people who are being encouraged to go to college, and here we have a huge deficit for people with, what you really need is a mechanical aptitude. And as long as you have certain basic mechanical aptitude, this is a great path. And unfortunately, there's not enough to fuel the industry right now.
Question for Frank. When you saw your counter sales dropping and you realized it's the shortage in the construction industry, what strategy have you used to try to counteract that?
Yeah, so we first said, do customers know about, are we doing a good job with the online offering? So this year we'll do $2.5 billion in B2B and B2C combined, which is good because we're kind of light years ahead of within our industry, but certainly on par with others. But are we going to customers and saying, okay, this is how you should think about obtaining product? And is there a better way of, should we expand our hours in the evening the night before and just say, hey, you don't have to wait till you hit the job site in order, call us after hours. So maybe we're creating part of this problem by not being accessible. So having the accessibility 24/7 online and having somebody to back up that accessibility with a real voice, salesperson, is very important, because some of it may be an engineering question and that kind of thing. It also means, how do we think about routing our trucks in the morning, dispatching them, making them more accessible, guaranteeing, I love the notion about delivering same day. We've been doing that for 65 years, but we do that. Maybe we change or add more vehicles in the morning as opposed to in the afternoon. So it changes us. And of course, the operative question is this a short-term situation or is it long-term? Because then you get into size and shape of our buildings and how we populate them. So it has lots of implications. I don't see it going away anytime soon. There is a huge shortage for skilled labor, for people like you were talking about, who can make a very good living and do very well in the construction industry, and they're just not being filled today.
Yes, my question is, how do you propose to, how would you recommend the government help with the shortage of labor? Especially in retail, at the beginning.
You had to direct that towards me. Did you?
You want to take this one?
That is a terrific question. How does the government help with the shortage of labor? Well, wow. So let me sort of provide a little context maybe as I try to think through this. The last 18 months, as you may know, the government, the Department of Labor, has had a lot of changes, actually made some and then didn't make them. You may know the Fair Labor Standard Act changes, right? The act from 1939 that set the minimum wage requirements and child labor sort of protection, all those things. You may be aware that last year, they required everyone to implement a new level of what would be exempt and non-exempt labor in the industry, which obviously had a fairly wide effect across retail in total, because there's a lot of full-time and part-time associates who work enough, but they may have a managerial role and be considered exempt under the old rules. To give you specifics, the Department of Labor before this point had about a $27,000 limit that said anybody who makes more than $27,000 and had direction of schedule of labor and direction of other people's time and hours, et cetera, is a manager. Well, they changed that number to 47,000 last year. It wasn't a stair-step program, they just said it's 47. That actually had a big impact on a lot of retailers who started taking the labor the other way and said, you know what, I'm now going to go more part-time. It's just to be able to reflect that I have a business, or shareholders, I've got a profit I have to hit. And there are a lot of people who are looking for more hours, maybe not full-time necessarily, but I know I'm answering your question sort of in reverse. I'm not sure the government's helping us at all at the moment, is what I would tell you. The number of regulations, the changing, the pace, I would say there's nothing wrong with that, what they suggested. It might be perfectly timed to do it. The impact it had on retail, though, was it was immediate. It was do it tomorrow, and that required just about every retailer I know to change the labor model they were using, and not necessarily in a good way for their organization. So I'm welcome to any other big ideas, Frank and Nathan. It's part of it.
It does affect service. I mean, going back to the counter example, it would be nice if that customer could call his or her salesperson after hours, but we don't allow cell phone utilization, because if we answered the call and helped out, that's overtime. And are we measuring that overtime, and how are we accounting for it, which is difficult to do, as you can imagine. So what that requires is us to shift to a backup support network that's more formalized in our facility, paying. But it takes some of the it numbs some of the aggressive or customer service spirit, if you will, about doing anything I can to take care of a customer. It's not an issue of paying overtime, but the risk associated with litigation if somebody was thinking they were doing for the good of the company, taking care of a customer by delivering a water heater at night, taking it upon themselves to do it, and we have lots of history of doing those kind of things. We can't do that anymore, so it kind of...
And I'll just add, and Frank triggered it, it gets worse by state, by the way. If you have locations in every part of the country, California, for example, has its own overtime rules, right? If you work more than 8 hours in a day, you're getting overtime, where most other states have 40 hours and then it's overtime. And then there's paycheck requirements, right? So the government has, in every paycheck in various states, it has to have a different requirement. I have more lawyers than I know what to do with as a result of this, keeping us compliant. More than I should have, I should say, as part of it. Anyway, thanks for the question.
So what's happening in Texas and Louisiana? Right now there's over $100 billion worth of new plants being constructed in the petrochemical industry. And there's just this huge shortage of, so a number of the large chemical companies are in fact bankrolling programs at the community colleges to have operators trained. The construction companies are training welders, so you can come and be paid to learn how to weld. So in my specific vantage point, it's private industry actually taking the steps to solve this deficit problem, as opposed to a government solution.
So I think we have time for just one more question so we can wrap up, and I do see one hand, so we will go ahead and wrap up with this question.
Thank you. First off, I really appreciate you all being here. This has been a fabulous panel discussion. My question actually is probably not so much to the three of you, and Brent, you're the representative here. In the 50 years that we're celebrating now, the MBA program, is it possible when I look at these four, including our missing panelists, see these four white gentlemen, could we have had more diversity on this panel?
It's a really interesting question in the panel this morning. And this is actually a great question. If you attended the lunch with the EPs, this is something that if you look at the executive partner program that we started originally, the retired pool that came to the Williamsburg area was very homogeneous. That's beginning to change. And that's a great thing as we begin to look out and see that, because you see a classic glass ceiling at certain levels. There was Wonder Woman this weekend is the movie that came out, and they talked about a woman director of a superhero movie. That just doesn't happen. And the article I read talked about this, even in the movie industry, how few women directors there are. And so there are so many glass ceiling issues across industries. But yet we look at our undergrad, as an institution at William & Mary, undergrad business and across the institution, we have a majority of women, at least across the institution. And in the MBA, it's an increasingly larger pool of women in the program. That if you went back maybe 15, 20, 30 years, and so I would say is that is, there are cultural and other challenges that have to be overcome, but there are also structural things that are improving that pool. Companies are specifically initiating diversity type programs, and research is showing that a diversity of perspective at the board level, whether it's ethnic or gender, is companies actually perform better with that perspective. And so I think there is a greater awareness and need for that. In some ways at the board level, there is a lack of that pool. And so I think increasingly, that over the next 15, 20 years, we're going to find that as we begin to educate more and more qualified individuals that are going to move into that, and companies recognize and embrace that, hopefully we'll be able to see more and more a shift towards a balance that represents society, but also gives us a greater diversity of ideas.
I just think this was a missed opportunity.
Well, and I do recognize that, and I think as we were trying to go out to the alumni in the the C-suite staff, we are reaching out, and we hope that at say the 55th or 60th anniversary, we're going to see a much different pool. And as I look at across the room and I see several of my former students, the expectation or hope is that they will be the ones setting up here, speaking to what will be a very different, enormous problem as well. And I appreciate the sensitivity and the challenge, and I think this is changing, and we are kind of at a tipping point in many ways that hopefully that 5, 10, 15 years from now, we will see a very different mix, just that represents what's going on in the ranks that we have. But thank you for that comment. And we thank you all very much for your comments, your attendance, and more importantly, or just as importantly, we thank our executives for their time. They've taken time out of their busy schedules to come and to be able to help them and educate us, but also enlighten us in some very interesting and enormous challenges. So we want to thank them very much for their time, and thank you very much.